Are you sure this is what you want? The djinn asked slyly. Milo had thought about it long and hard in the days leading up to conducting the ritual. He knew that more material wishes would come with major drawbacks. Winning lottery numbers from a past jackpot. Billions of dollars, arrested after the IRS tries to collect taxes. Infinite untraceable wealth, $1 billion crypto wallet with a lost password. Become emperor of the world? Now you have to worry about assassins or rebellions, and that's not even getting into the headache that is bureaucracy. No, it was clear that with only one wish, he had to make one that wouldn't lead to anything that could arouse suspicion. He would have to play the long game. Yes, I wish to never experience death. Interesting phrasing. To not experience death. Yes, no matter what illness, injury, or other calamity befalls me, I wish to never experience death. As you wish, so it shall be. A rumble filled the room, and the djinn began to glow with a warm light. Then, with a loud crash, the whole room was filled with a bright flash. Then, the djinn was gone, as were all traces of the ritual he had used to summon it. His apartment was back to its organized state. At least, as much as it could be, considering all he had to his name was a beat-up couch, a tiny, cracked LCD TV, and a small wireless internet router that only worked when it wanted to. He took a deep breath. So far, he didn't feel physically different. Perhaps that was the point. He was functionally immortal now. With that, it was now time to form the next stage of his plan. One pizza delivery later, thanks to a coupon that hadn't expired, he was sitting on the floor of his apartment, scouring the internet. This time, he wasn't job hunting or looking up porn. Instead, he was looking to see which of the multitudes of billionaires lived closest to him. It was a simple plan. Use his newfound immortality to survive an otherwise fatal accident, and extort the billionaire for hush money. If there was one thing he was certain of, it was that the wealthy prefer to throw money at their problems. He knew he couldn't just get hurt at one of their companies. The billionaire had to be directly involved. It was at that moment that he found a name that caught his attention. Solomon White, 56 years old, president and CEO of EisenCorp. While not immediately known to the wider world, EisenCorp had become a major player in the tech world due to snagging some high-profile defense contracts, particularly after the recent election. From what he uncovered with his research, Solomon White was the epitome of a parasitic bastard. Net worth larger than the GDP of a destabilized nation? Check. Clearly built his company using inherited wealth but repeatedly credits his success to hard work? Check. Notoriously out of touch with the struggles of the working class? Check. As he dug deeper through the myriad of fluff-riddled think pieces, self-indulgent op-eds, and glowing profiles where the writers spent 500 words or more verbally gratifying White like a high-end escort in a luxury hotel room, he couldn't find anything to indicate that Solomon White did anything other than lecture poor people about how poor they are and schmooze with crooked politicians. In every photo, White's gaunt face, framed by a white mustache and beard akin to the Romanovs, combined with a pair of narrow eyes locked in a permanent sneer, created a man who seemed to look upon the world with complete arrogance and disdain. He seemed keen on presenting himself as some sort of erudite scholar, a visionary Renaissance man who could guide the world to a bright future if only humanity would abandon lofty ideals such as basic human decency. Milo was finding plenty of reasons to hate Solomon White, but struggling to find some way to get close enough to put his plan into motion. At that moment, his phone briefly buzzed on the coffee table. A text message. It was from his friend Odie. "Hey man, I know you're kinda in between jobs right now," it said. "I just took on this massive catering gig at this event at the Van Norn Center tonight. If you can help out, you'll get free food." Upon looking around his apartment and the nearly empty pizza box, Milo somewhat considered whether or not his newfound immortality meant he didn't need to eat. No, it will be too suspicious if he disappears. Plus, Odie's helped him out many times in the past. He should probably repay him. "What's the gig?" he texted back. "Some charity thing," Odie immediately replied. "This group's presenting an award to some CEO for his innovation. All I know is that they ordered food for about 200. It was at that moment that a web page Milo had barely opened automatically refreshed. It was a website for a TV news station that would routinely update its homepage when news stories were published. There, below the featured stories, was a headline that caught his attention. EisenCorp CEO to be honored at Charity Gala. He clicked on the headline, finding an article that essentially regurgitated a press release. Solomon White, president and CEO of EisenCorp, will be recognized by the Shadow Mountain Technology Foundation at their annual Freedom of Innovation Gala at the Van Norn Center. Milo placed down a third tray of food on the large banquet table provided by the center. Odie's catering company would partner with different restaurants depending on what the clients had ordered. For this event, they had requested Italian cuisine, so the heated trays contained different dishes comprised of the same 3 ingredients: pasta, cheese, and meat. Vegetarians had the option of a salad. The job itself was simple: carry in the trays of food, set up the small burners that would keep them warm, and replace the trays when they run out. Fortunately, the uniform he was expected to wear was a relatively unassuming one, so he would have no trouble blending in. The overall decor of the event had posed the question of how many different ways can we decorate with the colors red, white, and blue? Curtains, streamers, tablecloths, cups, plates. It resembled a political rally rather than a charity gala. It was the usual crowd of overly wealthy socialites, desperate to convince themselves they were making the world a better place by pretending to throw money at a problem. Despite it being called a gala, the manner of dress was just slightly more formal than office attire. Men were wearing suits and basic ties with Windsor knots, while women wore the kind of dresses one would be seen wearing to a church service. In his brief bits of downtime, Milo continually scanned the crowd, trying to locate Solomon White. Despite the presentation being scheduled for 7 p.m., the event was nearly 30 minutes behind. "You looking for someone?" asked Odie, who had been standing nearby. Compared to Milo, Odie was in much better shape. While he wasn't exactly a model, his work in catering had led him to develop a skinny, toned physique. He had recently taken to wearing frameless glasses, which meant that in moments where they caught light, 2 bright, round orbs could be seen framed by wavy, dark hair. By contrast, Milo had relied almost entirely on his genetics to keep himself skinny. He was never one for exercise, but his lack of a car meant he had to walk most everywhere. It was not enough to offset the impacts of a diet largely consisted of convenience store foods. While he would insist it was merely baby fat, anyone with a functioning pair of eyes could tell he was chubby. "Just looking around," said Milo. "People watching." Odie simply shrugged. The two diligently waited near a wall as the patrons continued mingling. Suddenly, the chatter died down as someone walked onto the stage on the opposite end of the room. "Sorry for the delay," said the MC. "Had to sort out some technical issues." After the usual pleasantries and corny jokes, the award presentation quickly got underway. It was then that Milo finally saw him, the target of his harebrained scheme. Solomon White looked every bit as arrogant in the flesh as he did in his photos. This time, he was wearing an all-white suit with a black tie, once again with a Windsor knot. The arrogance extended to his low, deep voice as he went through the formality of accepting the award and giving his usual spiel about hard work. The presentation was over as briefly as it had begun, likely due to the fact that no news outlet had bothered to show up. Milo figured even the press had a limit regarding how much they wanted to cover this man. White began moving about the floor of the venue, socializing with the numerous guests, but curiously not partaking of the food. Milo continued to watch as he mingled, although he wasn't even sure how he was going to move forward with his plan. "I'm guessing he's the reason you took the job," said Odie, smirking. "I'm not one to judge. I mean, I understand the appeal of a silver fox, but I don't think you're his type." It's not that," said Milo. "I mean, have you read about this guy?" "You're not going to pull a Luigi, are you?" No. I mean, do I look like I could even afford a gun?" "I don't know, man. Your fortune changes from week to week. Weren't you on an occult kick for a bit? Heard you were tracking down some books at that weird store downtown." "It was just..." Milo scrambled to think of something. He knew he couldn't let the secret of his newfound immortality slip. "I was trying to get with a girl who looked like she was into that stuff." "Ah. I take it that didn't work?" Milo said nothing, hoping that Odie would take it as a sign to not push further. The night eventually wound down, and most of the food had been eaten, which made cleanup relatively easy, especially since the trays were disposable. As the catering team finished loading the last of their equipment, Milo scanned the various cars that had begun leaving the parking garage. Due to the wealthy clientele in attendance, a number of them had personal valets that drove up to the convention center entrance. It wasn't long until he once again spotted Solomon White, exiting the building as a long, black limousine pulled up. It was easy to spot as White's due to the vanity license plates showing AIZCRP. The door popped open on its own as he approached, and he quickly stepped inside. As Milo watched it pull away, he considered throwing himself in front of it, but considering his plan, the driver would be the one at fault, not White himself. The amount of money he could hope to get from an accident settlement was small compared to how much he was after. No, it had to be something where there was no doubt that White was at fault. Days passed, and Milo was nowhere closer to going through with his plan. Making matters worse was the fact that rent was coming due. The small amount of money he earned from Odie was nowhere near enough. He needed to get the money soon. His landlord had been keen on kicking out any tenant who missed a payment, regardless of circumstance. Up until the moment he was fired from his previous job, he had been on time with his payments, even if it had left him without money for all but the cheapest food one could find at the closest dollar store. Such was the case when he was waiting in the checkout line, holding a basket full of shelf-stable foods that required little to no cooking nor refrigeration. Mainly breakfast cereals, sandwich bread, peanut butter, and a case of instant ramen. Perhaps he should have wished for wealth after all, at least enough to be able to cheat the legal system. Whenever he was in the dollar store, like most other patrons, he typically avoided the others. Nobody asked questions, just minded their own business. The only exception was the occasional group of children, but even then, there was almost an unspoken rule about not acknowledging their situation, especially in front of them. As such, Milo was typically in and out relatively quickly, even when lines were long. Nobody was up for chit-chat. Such was the case here, as he and the cashier made very limited eye contact. As he exited the store, he noticed a familiar limousine driving up the road. The vanity plate was unmistakable, but why on earth would it be driving on what is ostensibly on the poor side of the city? It came to a stop in front of a small office building from where Milo was standing. He saw the door open and a figure emerge. It was none other than White himself, who hurried inside. Milo paused for a moment. If he ran his groceries home and came back, there was a pretty strong chance that White would be long gone. It's not like he had anything that could spoil, but it was going to be a pain to carry. Still, he needed to act. He couldn't let this opportunity pass by. He tried to act nonchalant as he crossed the street over to the office building. By the time he was close, the limousine had pulled away, but he hadn't seen White leave the building. The office building was one that leased different parts to different businesses, doctors, accountants, law firms, and so on. As such, there was no one at the entrance to spot him as he came in. He looked at a directory that hung on the wall closest to the door. Curiously, much of it was blank save for a couple of businesses, a personal injury law firm on the top floor and a chiropractic clinic on the suite directly below it. The only sign there had been any other businesses was a few remaining pieces of dried adhesive that held the old signs in place. Perhaps Solomon White was a patient of the chiropractic clinic. Hardly blackmail material unless the chiropractor was dealing in something shady, and even then it would be questionable. It certainly couldn't be the law firm. Eisenkorp's legal team is one of the most feared in the corporate world. Milo walked further into the building, visually scanning the different doors and dimmed windows. While the hallway was lit with a combination of cheap fluorescent lights and ambient sunlight, many of the offices were seemingly empty. As he rounded a corner, he found himself in a darkened part of the building, the lights shut off. It was at that moment that he heard the faint sound of music. Although it was clearly being muffled, he could hear a strong bass line. As his eyes adjusted, he could see what looked like vinyl signage on a door at the very end of the hall. It was still too dark to make out what it said. The only thing he could somewhat recognize was a circular symbol resembling an eye. A pinkish-red light peered out from the sides of the door, noticeably brighter on one side in particular. Someone hadn't closed it all the way. Stashing his groceries in a dark corner, Milo crept up to the door, peering through the gap. He saw what looked like a reception desk. A lone computer monitor sat on one side, but no one was behind it. The dim red mood lighting blended with the blue light of the monitor, but even then, it was difficult to make out much else. He nudged the door, slowly opening it wider. The hinges let out a soft creak. He then sidled his way into the room, trying to squeeze himself through the gap without opening the door any wider. When the door creaked a second time, he hurried past, hoping nobody heard anything. Amidst the mood lighting, there wasn't too much that was remarkable about the room. There weren't even any chairs in the reception area. He did see 2 more hallways leading to different rooms. The music was slightly louder, enough for him to recognize it as a K-pop song that had been making the rounds on Western music charts. He couldn't quite discern where it was coming from. His heart was rattling within his ribcage. What was he doing, sneaking in here? What even is here? Either way, he could tell he stumbled across some grade A blackmail material. He pulled out his phone and began taking pictures. Moving with a little more confidence, he walked over to the reception area, peering over the desk to see what was on the computer monitor. It was a split-screen display showing 4 different security camera angles. One showed the street outside, the steady stream of cars rolling by. Next to it was a view of the hallway just outside the door he had squeezed through. Below the first angle was a view of some sort of parking lot. It must be in the back of the building, he thought. The final angle pointed right at the reception desk, where he could see himself leaning over. He shouldn't be here. Someone could... Wait. What was he so afraid of? He went through the trouble of making that wish, and here he is worried that someone's going to spot him. What are they going to do? Kill him? He stepped away from the reception desk and looked towards the 2 halls. After a brief moment of eeny, meeny, miny, mo, he went down one of them. The overall layout of the area had 2 rooms on each side of the space. All 4 sets of doors were closed. As he passed the first door in the hall he had chosen, he leaned in close, trying to see if he could hear anything. Nothing. He crept further down to the next door, once again leaning close. This time, he heard something. A voice, but one speaking a language he couldn't understand. It was soft, feminine, speaking in a playful tone. He then heard a second voice, much deeper, speaking the same language in response. There was no doubt about it, it was White. The door was shut tight, so he couldn't see what they were doing, but it was no doubt something shady. It was at that moment that he heard a third voice, also soft, but much higher, and much less playful. In fact, it was more hoarse, like someone trying to speak after a long bout of crying. The voice let out what sounded like a moan, not one of pleasure, but of pain. Milo felt a brick drop in his stomach. His chest grew tight, and it was taking every bit of willpower not to hyperventilate. Given the secrecy of the location, the mood lighting, and the closed doors, there was only one unfortunate conclusion he could come to. Blackmail and extortion were not enough anymore. Solomon White needed to fucking die. As Milo began to turn, he suddenly felt his vision go black, followed by an intense pain on his head. He slumped to the ground as his limbs went limp, yet he remained conscious. Although he was awake, his body would not respond to his commands to move, not even his eyelids. His vision struggled to return, so he could only make out 2 looming figures, speaking the same language as before with deep, husky voices, no doubt trying to whisper. They proceeded to pick him up and carry him out of the suite. Blood began to run into his eyes as they carried him. You'd think they would have put a bag over his head or something. They didn't leave out the way he had entered, but instead through a rear entrance. The 2 figures unceremoniously dropped him onto the ground. Surely the shock would have worn off by now. Why couldn't he move? His vision had cleared up, and he could see the 2 men towering over him. They didn't even seem to notice that his eyes were still open. As they continued casually chatting, Milo watched as they wrapped him up in some sort of tarp, covering his face. Once again, he was lifted up and thrown into a tighter space without any semblance of care. Soon, the tight space began to move. He was in a car. He knew if he could just pull the safety latch, now standard in most trunks, he could dive out. But his body still would not move. He tried to shake, writhe, twitch, something, anything, but to no avail. He wasn't sure how much time had passed when the car stopped. He had heard the trunk pop open, and he felt someone lift him out, carrying him over their shoulder like a sack of potatoes. The next thing he knew, he was once again thrown to the ground. When the tarp was removed from his face, he could see he was in some sort of warehouse. His eyes were fixed to the sky. He could not look in any direction, only straight ahead. In his peripheral vision, he saw someone dressed head to toe in protective gear designed for those handling hazardous materials, a white protective plastic suit, a face mask, safety goggles, and rubber gloves. Then came the sound of a chainsaw.